Are you a slave of God? Welcome to your daily 180 Bible study. We've been talking about being slaves of God and what that entails. Not only does it bring tremendous responsibility, we are stewards of the great blessings that God has entrusted to our care. We are servants to one another, but we also recognize that there are tremendous rewards that come with being slaves to God. Because we don't receive what we deserve as slaves, we receive the gift that God has promised to us, a gift of everlasting life, as Paul explains in Romans 6, verse 23, and as Jesus tells us in Revelation 2 and verse 10. A slave is a humble position, and yet so often we read about slaves being exalted, even above the greatest rulers around them. In Genesis chapter 37, we read about Joseph, who is sold by his brothers into slavery. But God exalted him. In Genesis 39, we find him in the house of Potiphar in Egypt, and he is exalted in that household where nobody has any more authority than he does, except for his master. Later on, when he is falsely accused and he is thrown into prison, what do we find? But again, he is exalted in that place. And the one who is in charge of the prison doesn't think about anything that's in the care of Joseph, because he knows he is going to be faithful. And in time, God makes this lowly slave, according to chapter 45, verse 8, a father to Pharaoh. This isn't the only time we find slaves being exalted like this in the Scriptures. Moses and Aaron were both born Israelite slaves in Exodus chapter 2. But by the time we get to Exodus chapter 7, God has made Moses, we are told, as God to Pharaoh himself. And Aaron is his prophet. In Philippians chapter 2, we are told that we should take for ourselves the mind of Christ. What does that mind look like? It's the mind of a slave. In Philippians 2 verse 5, he tells us that we should take this mind upon us. He was in the form of God, but he was willing to surrender that. And he made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant, of a slave, and coming in the likeness of men. And what happened as a result? God has highly exalted him and given him the name that is above every name. If we will be humble as slaves to God, as James tells us in James 4 verse 10, if we will humble ourselves in the sight of the Lord, he will lift you up. There's nothing more humble than a slave. Will you be a slave to God?